What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another installment of the Tech Town Hall. I am your host, back from a whirlwind adventure over in Europe and going to the IBC show last month. But we were back in the studio this month with the OG team. It is myself, William Goldie, here from the sales team at PTZOptics and HuddleCam HD, alongside Mike Luttermoser in the studio with us. And we are also bringing in a special guest from a remote location. His name is Brian Mulcahy. He helps out with a lot of our digital asset creation and post-production. Now, last month, we had a great discussion between Mike, Steven, and Matt Davis. Steven and Matt Davis are taking the month off because I took the month off last month. And they were all talking about production. So that kind of ties back to our original discussion, the very first Tech Town Hall that we hosted, which was all about what is a studio. So we kind of wanted to loop that back around to rediscover some of those topics that we originally spoke about back in January. And then also to kind of talk about some do's and don'ts when it comes to production. Now, obviously, there is a production side of things, and that's where things like PTZOptics cameras and video switchers and production softwares come into big play. And that's one side of it. And the other side is post-production. Now, this show that you are currently watching was actually recorded earlier this week, much like most quote-unquote live television is. It's called live to tape. Then what happens after that is every time that I fumble over my words because I don't know what I'm doing, Mike and Brian have to go in and correct that to make it look like I actually know what's up. So today we're going to talk about how they do that. And then also Brian is very skilled in digital asset creation. He helps make a lot of our 3D wiring diagrams, which we have distributed to all of the channel resellers out there. Hopefully some end users have seen these as well. They just help to visualize what a system looks like, because how many times as a reseller or as a distributor or even as an end user has someone asked you, wait, what does a studio system look like? Or what does a live production, live broadcast, live streaming, video conferencing system actually look like? Now, Brian has made some awesome assets for us digitally, so we're going to have him walk us through his process just to get an idea of what that looks like. And the whole idea here is we want to just give you some workflows and some best practices for, hey, doing a live stream, relatively easy. You get your cameras, you get your mics, you get your lights set up, and you're pretty much good to go. Now, if you want to up your production quality, you need to include things like lower thirds and graphics. You see on this show, as we go through different cuts and we cut from one host to another host and ask questions, Mike is actually in real time creating some of that, but he also pulls from an asset library that he has, which was created before the production. So we went over a little bit of that in the production conversation last month, and then this month we're going over what happens when we turn off the cameras, step out of the studio, and then refine and make these videos that much better to go up to the YouTubes where they end up. So without further ado, Mike, how we doing this month? And thank you for stepping in last month for me.
Yeah, not a problem. Thanks for joining us today. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, man. Good. I love that you have the home improvement Wilson face. Like if you just went, there we go. I don't know if we might get sued for that one. Hey, home improvement, don't sue us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so last week we talked, or last month I should say, perfect. There's an edit that you get to make before this goes to YouTube. Last month we talked about production. This month we're talking about post-production. Mm-hmm. Right now, actually, a point that I want to talk to, we actually have Brian recording his screen because he's going to be doing something live, and then we have you recording everything that we're doing in here. And that also happens when we bring in Steven and Matt. Why do we do that?
We do that to kind of like a plan B if anything like happens during the recording, that there's separate employees that are recording on their end. And so it just like mitigates like risk of something happening, like the recording crashing, stuff like that.
Yeah. So this comes back to our original conversation in January where we talked about redundancy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Steven has NDI and SDI cables to all of his cameras. So if you continue that redundancy conversation, then like if you're bringing somebody in remotely, have them record too, because we've actually had it happen here where like their video just goes blocked and choppy, and then all of a sudden, if we were just recording on our end and not on Steven's end, we wouldn't have that footage, and we'd have to redo this, and it would waste everyone's day and time. So redundancy is key. So if you're doing anything live to tape, I would say don't rely on a single source of video recording. Try to do both. That's if you're bringing somebody in remotely. And then when we get done filming this show, what happens then, Mike? What does your workflow look like after we turn off the cameras and I go back to my day job?
Yeah. So what happens is then downloading, uploading, and organizing file assets for the post-production process, which is usually just editing. And we edit out the bloopers, and we edit out things maybe that were not said correctly, anything that goes wrong. If there's something in the recording where there's like the recording goes, you don't have to edit around that. But then also adding in other production assets to the Tech Town Hall, like animations and graphics, usually.
Got it.
That's it.
What are some practices that you can think of, like in production, that makes sense, that help you from a post-production standpoint? Is there anything that you're doing while we're recording that is specific to the post-production process, or is it just a matter of going back and watching the video and kind of picking out those parts and editing them just like that right there?
Yeah, so you can like in this like recording, I could have other assets set up where I could do something like let me see here. Where are you at? There you are. So I can use assets like this that I have built in vmix, like your lower third comes up, William Goldie, or in post-production, I could add that in as well.
Got it.
So like right now, having assets built in already, like lower thirds or pictures or other videos, really just helps that process along. But you could just, we could just record our interview right now, and I could do that all like in Adobe Premiere or DaVinci or any other program for post-production.
Got it. And that brings up a good question. What software do you use when you go to the editing side of the world? So we're in vmix right now, and you guys talked about that last month, and there's other softwares. We just use vmix. There's also OBS, and why am I blanking on the rest of them? But there's a bunch.
Wirecast, OBS,
Wirecast.
vmix.
Yep.
Those are the three main ones. Yeah.
Yep. And then so in post-production, what is it that you go to? What's your go-to software?
Right now, it's the Adobe Suite. I am interested in learning other. There's like DaVinci that I'm really interested in. I think Brian, he works in DaVinci. Speaking of Brian, maybe we should bring him on, see if we can ask him.
Brian, you also do some video editing, so we'll bring in Brian here.
Hold on. There we go.
Hey, there he is.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
So, Mike and I both do some of the video editing for systems. So we usually like split up the projects depending on, like Mike's often in the studio and I'm often remote for the time being. So, if there's something more suited towards being in the studio, Mike will do that. And then if there's something more suited towards like really long render times or, stuff that has to be, watched for long periods of time, then I'll usually take care of something like that from over here.
Got it.
But yeah,
go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
No worries. This is a completely random question. So I went to film school, and one of the things that we always talked about in post-production is that to expect something like a 10-to-1 ratio of filmed to used. Now that's for scripted material, and that's multiple different takes. We do live to tape. How much do you expect to actually cut out of a live to tape production, or is it really just kind of just cleaning it up?
That 10-to-1 sounds spot on because it's funny. It's really hard to tell how things work together until they're together. So a lot of the time, you'll get a shot or even like a sequence of shots that seems to make sense until you have the whole video together and then all of a sudden it doesn't. Even if you have good footage and good audio and all that, sometimes things just don't even fit the narrative. So it does get really tricky. And one of the hardest things I would say is towards the end, trying to fill in all the gaps with stuff that, you know, fits the context naturally instead of feeling like, you know, several videos all in one mixed together.
Yeah. So that maintenance of continuity, I guess, is the challenge, which is why I could never make it in the editing room, by the way, because I just don't have the attention span. I would get 10 minutes into a video and just be on my phone or doing something else, and that's on me. So I know what I'm good at. Anyway, but yeah, so speaking, I guess, to like creating continuity, bringing stuff together, a lot of what we do now does involve these 3D renderings, which you, Brian, kind of head up. And I know you wanted to kind of show us a little bit of the process that you go through, some of the techniques and some of the softwares that you use to create these things. And again, to the audience, really the reason that we want to show this is because bringing in these digital assets, these graphics, like Mike was saying, he has a bunch of these preloaded into vmix. Vmix comes with a bunch of templates. You can create yours even in real time if you wanted to, but creating some of that digital asset beforehand can be very, very helpful because that's something that you could then bring in either in the middle of the production or in post-production. You know that you have that to bring in. So when I start talking about a camera and I start talking about a layout or we're talking about a use case or a vertical that we work in, Brian, you have assets that you create. So we're going to go ahead and toss it over to you. Walk us through a little bit of that graphic asset creation process that you do.
Yeah, I think it would help to kind of tell a little bit of a story of why we started doing that, because it wasn't the original. The way it panned out is not what we were trying to do, but it ended up being way better. So Mike and I were trying to get just better footage for the videos we were making for work. So we were trying to use, you know, a lot of the stuff that you hear about more often to try and, you know, up your production quality, like green screens and, you know, mainly I would say using like what you would normally call, I guess you could consider them largely compositing techniques where you're taking data from the video and then using that to change the video. And so like, for example, if we wanted like, you know, a really cool shot of a product, we would try and put it in front of a green screen, go through all the chroma keying steps. And then, you know, we have this cut out footage of one of the products. And we realized that it's not just hard, it's a combination of you need good software and it's difficult and you need to have good lighting and you need to have a good green screen. And there were so many elements that we kind of started to realize that for just two people, it was a little too much for us to really be successful with. If you have a team, you can definitely make that work. And a lot of people do, but for just two people, it was too much. So we tried to find another solution. And I had been watching Carter Crew on YouTube, and they show all kinds of post-production techniques that are used in the movie industry and in the advertisement industry. And I noticed they were using a program called Blender to make stuff in CG. And that what shocked me was it's free. It's totally open source. And it was really good, but it's improving at a rate that I think shocks everyone, partially because it's open source. I think people are used to open source projects not panning out that well sometimes because, you know, when there's not financial incentive a lot of the time, you know, you could see how that could happen. But Blender has been this amazing success that is now branching out even beyond CG. So it has, they just added a real-time compositor, meaning normally when you want to add anything on top of footage, if it's, say you want to add something CG to regular footage, that's a really time-consuming process, and you can't even necessarily see what you're doing while you're doing it. You kind of have to do your best and then render and then see if it looks right and try again. As where now it's real time, you can see exactly what you did at the frame rate that it's intended to be at instead of, 2 frames a second or something. So that's really cool for a free program. And they just keep adding features like that. So I decided to try to learn it. And I've never found a software that was easier to learn because there's so many resources on YouTube. So in just a year now, I think it's been about a year and a half. I've gone from having never done any CG at all to doing it every day for, teaser videos, commercials, how-to videos, and the diagrams as well. So I really encourage people to check it out at the very least, because it just keeps getting better at an awesome rate. So I figured I could show you a little bit about what it can do and how it works.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. I'd also like to mention there's kind of like 3 main pipelines that we go through in post-production. There's sort of the CG pipeline, the video pipeline, and the photo pipeline. And besides the photo pipeline, the other 2 both involve audio usually. So, weirdly, these pipelines are becoming more and more integrated, which is really nice because it's allowing us to mix CG with footage really easily, even soon in real time with Unreal Engine. But basically in Blender, you have this 3D view where you can start building stuff. And this is the main view. You can, model something. You could also paint, actually. You can paint textures onto models or onto 2D objects. There's also this shading view, which has actually inspired a lot of post-production workflows like across the whole video and CG industry. And you've probably seen other softwares with something similar to this. So I can just add in a cube. So this is one of the coolest things, probably my favorite thing about CG and Blender is in most production softwares, you can bring in textures. Usually they can only be photos. I mean, you might be able to generate some textures or something like that, but really you usually end up with just, using colors for things or effects. It's a little bit limited once you compare it to Blender's shader editor. So we have these nodes. So these are just blocks of code that do things for you that you can also change to allow them to do, whatever you need them to do. So right now I just went into rendered view. So we're rendering in real time with Blender's cycles engine, which I shouldn't say real time, actually. Blender has a real time engine called Eevee. Cycles, with so little in your scene, cycles is almost real time, but the more you start adding to your scene, the more complicated it gets and the longer it takes to render. But right now it should be pretty fast. So I'm just gonna add a light, which is one of the main advantages to cycles because it has physically accurate lighting. So, sorry, I'm just going here. All right, so now we have some lights. I'm just gonna add a floor just because it helps make the light bounce a little bit more naturally. And probably pick a more neutral lighting setup like that. That's better. So now I can show you what I mean by these materials being so cool, because they're kind of not just materials. I've seen people make games in here that you can play, which is kind of crazy. But to give you an idea, there are these textures. Like if I used a noise texture and plugged the color into the base color, you can see we have a noise texture now on the cube. But you don't just have to, it doesn't just have to be, the color of it. You could add something like a bump map, for example, and then plug the color into the bump map. And it is just like what it sounds like. You can see it's creating sort of a bumpy surface. So if we plug that into our material, it now looks bumpy. And this is sort of faking bumpiness, but there's also displacement options in here if you want to actually displace the geometry. So you can really take this. I mean, there's kind of no limit. People even model with this, and it really can make whatever you want to put on top of your footage, whatever type of these digital assets, look, real if you wanted them to, or have a certain style. There's not a whole lot of nodes in here, but believe it or not, it's pretty much all you need to make most things. So, there's like a node for glass if we wanted the cube to look like glass. I've never come across a rendering engine faster than this, which is pretty crazy considering it's free. Another one of the CG softwares that we use is called Houdini. And that's actually more so the industry standard. It's a little bit different than Blender in the sense that when you do things in Blender, you can do them sort of two ways. You can do them destructively or non-destructively, which they usually call a procedural workflow. And there could be limitations I don't know of, but in my opinion, and based on everything I know, there is no disadvantage to a procedural workflow for the most part, and there are only disadvantages to a destructive workflow. And what I mean by that is that's kind of where the nodes come in. So in Blender, it's partially destructive, partially procedural. So if I model something, it's modeled. If I want to change it, undo, whatever, I need to use the undo button or manually fix it. As we're in Houdini, it's a little bit different. It works in the same way as the shader editor or, the material editor in Blender, where you add nodes to do things. So for example, say I were to cut an object in half in Houdini, that's not permanent. I can disconnect and reconnect that node that is cutting the object in half at any point. And you can think of how you could have many different iterations of something that you wanted to do without losing any of them, without having a bunch of different project files. And the reason I'm talking so much about this is because as we look at these post-production softwares, they keep adopting more and more of this type of workflow because it seems to be the most advantageous for a lot of these non-destructive reasons. So the entirety of Houdini works in that way. It's procedural. So if I were to add, same thing, the cube in here, if I wanted to, let's say, one of the things you can do when you're modeling something is going to add a loop cut, but I'm not, yeah, here it is. So an edge loop. So I can sort of cut this geometry in half, and you can see when I did that, it added a polysplit node. So if I were to disconnect this, this little flag shows, it's the visibility toggle basically. So you can see this box is not split in half until I connect this node and choose that for visibility. So you can also do really complex stuff without having it loaded in the viewport all the time, which is also really useful. I've actually been trying to switch to Houdini from Blender because it's entirely procedural, but it's a lot more complicated. And that's one of the main advantages of Blender is you can do a lot of the same stuff in a much easier way. Blender also has all kinds of other stuff built in, like it can do motion tracking. It has a reasonable video editor, actually. So here is one of I think this was the Simple Track teaser. I did not see the title. Okay, so it's, yeah, the commercial for the Simple Track. So if I go over to the video editing tab, you can see this is the video editor in Blender. I will say it's very bare bones. It doesn't have a whole lot of features yet, and they are trying to add them, but it does perform really well. It makes proxies really quickly, and there's a lot of customization over that. So if you don't know what a proxy is, basically, if you're a good example would be if you have a project you're working on and all the footage is 4K, it's really difficult for your computer to, while you're editing live, play that footage back. So it'll create a proxy, which is sort of a lower quality version of your actual footage for you to, it's not necessarily always lower quality, but just a more efficient way for your computer to render the video for you while you're editing. And I have to admit, Adobe products, I've had the worst experience in that regard with proxies. They take forever to load. To put it into perspective, I'm using a 16 core with 128 gigs of RAM and a 3090. And After Effects and Premiere are just constantly loading proxies, the little red or yellow, or once it's loaded, green bar above all the footage. And DaVinci doesn't really have that problem, and neither does Blender. They kind of you can just scrub right through 4K footage, at least on a computer like this. But even I would imagine if you had an RTX 2080 and even like 8 to 10 cores, it probably wouldn't be that much slower than this. So, because a lot of the main issue is software limitations. The reason Adobe has that issue is because they've been building on top of older software for a really long time. They never really rewrote their software. So although it has, arguably maybe more features than most other post-production software, it's just kind of bloated at this point. And DaVinci is so new and kind of like sparsely efficiently coded that it seems to be a lot more efficient. And I would actually recommend it over Adobe products. I've kind of noticed something of an exodus from Adobe products because people are getting so upset about it. So that's part of the reason Mike brought up wanting to learn DaVinci. But you can see I can scrub right through all of this and there's no loading. I mean, we're slowing down a little bit over here, but we are also recording in OBS. But even still, I mean, I would say that it's not a whole lot of clips, but we are overlaying some CG on top of this as well. So you can actually route whatever you've done over in the 3D view over into the video editing view, which makes things really nice. So I guess that's probably a good summary on that. Is there anything you guys think I've missed so far or I should focus more on?
No, other than anyone watching, if your mind wasn't just blowing, either A, you know what Blender is and you currently use it, or B, you have no idea what he just said. Because that's
Sorry,
awesome. No, that's totally fine.
I could definitely be more clear. There is actually one thing I forgot. It's actually, I'd say if the shader or the material editor isn't my favorite thing about Blender, this next part is, because basically people were upset that if I drop a cube into the shader editor and I displace it, technically it's not displaced because you're just kind of faking the displacement. So sorry, I should split this up a little bit more. So you can change the normals of an object, which is fake texture or displacement. The geometry is smooth, but you're just sort of adding an image on top to make it look like a material. And then there's actual displacement in the shader editor, which is not just an image. It actually displaces what you're seeing, but I should have clarified this before. It's not displacing the geometry. And there is a way to do that in Blender that they recently added. And it's basically how all of Houdini works. But
wait, Brian, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is that like an example? Remember the Blender donut when we built the donut and we were modeling it, and like instead of just slapping a texture onto the donut, we like modeled it so you could see like the pores. Is that the difference we're talking about?
Yeah, pretty much. So like basically the reason for this is sometimes you don't want if you have something really complicated, you don't want to actually displace that, because you could, in order to displace, you often have to add geometry so that there's higher resolution. Like a good example is this is a way a lot of modelers will work. They'll use subdivision modeling. So if I wanted to edit this cube, I can move vertices around like that. And you can see it has kind of harsh consequences, as opposed to if we were to subdivide this a few times, you can see how you get a smoother look. And now
it's cool.
It looks a lot more organic. So that's one of the reasons there are these different levels of basically how real you want things to look, because you can run out of processing power so fast it's not even funny. I mean, a lot of people probably, when I said 128 gigs of RAM, they were probably like, are you kidding me? But I run out like daily because a lot of the stuff we're building for some of these videos will be like 1 billion vertices or like 20 billion vertices, which is, kind of absurd. Houdini can handle complex stuff like that a lot better than Blender, but Houdini is not free. It's actually pretty expensive depending on how much money you're making with it. But this other part I wanted to show, it was inspired by the material editor. People wanted that same level of control, but over the actual geometry. And the reason this matters is because with shaders, if you make a really cool thing with material nodes, I'm interchanging shader and material. They're the same thing pretty much. So say you made something with shader nodes and you wanted to 3D print it. You haven't changed the geometry. It's still a cube basically, or whatever you started with. So you just can't 3D print that stuff. There's a similar system in Blender called geometry nodes. So I just added geometry nodes to this cube, and now we can do all kinds of crazy stuff to the actual geometry that can then be 3D printed. But also, this can kind of do a lot of the things that an artist can do, but you're programming them in, sort of. So this is for building machines that do things in Blender. For example, if I just grab a line, and then I can disconnect this. This is where the original geometry is coming from. We don't have to use the original geometry. We can add in, one of these simple pieces of geometry, or you can actually drag in your own model and do stuff to it like that. But say we wanted like a line of cubes. I mean, it's obviously super simple, but we can do instance on points. So we can instance this cube on the points of this mesh line. And now we have a bunch of cubes, and we can change, make a little more space there. We can change the number of cubes. We can actually animate this too if you wanted to have it to go to music. we can move them around because all of these are live sockets. So you can send data from outside of Blender in here if you wanted to. You can create attributes from this data that you can then take out of Blender or use in other parts of Blender. I mean, it's really like, it's kind of hard to think of some of the limitations until you really try to get crazy with it. But it can do some cool stuff like this pick instance part. You can send data in there to tell it to only render, one or a couple of those cubes using like Boolean math or stuff like that. A lot of coding concepts are applied in here and would be familiar to coders. But you can still, I don't really know how to code, and I still know how to use it reasonably well. I've modeled entire products for us just in here without manually moving any vertices, which is kind of nice. So yeah,
Wow.
the possibilities are constantly expanding with this too, because there's so many people working on making this software better.
That's awesome, to be perfectly honest.
It's a lot
Because
of fun.
yeah, no, it is wild because, kind of the whole concept of what this piece of production is to talk about where things were, where things are, and then where things are going, right? And that is a perfect example of like where things are and where things are going at the same time from a post-production standpoint. Whereas where my journey started with film and live production was editing 16 millimeter film on a Steinbeck table, which is a workbench basically with these DJ table looking things. And you'd spool up 16 millimeter film, and then you'd spool up your mag strip audio film. And then you'd have to go through and physically like cut and tape the film together. And then that's how you would make a 16 millimeter film. Now you can go into an open source piece of software if you got a pretty badass computer and animate and then edit video and kind of have it all in one. So that's very cool, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing that. Because I myself wasn't even aware of really how these things got done. I guess conceptually I understood how they happened or how we got from A to B. But I didn't really understand the complexity of the, we'll call it the software that you guys are using to actually make a lot of this stuff. So that's really cool.
I know, isn't it crazy?
That is wild.
Yeah.
Like my mind is blown now. Like so I actually edit in Adobe Rush because again, I'm lazy. I'm going to delete Adobe Rush and I'm just going to get Blender because it looks like I could probably just do everything I do in Adobe Rush in Blender, but then also all of the rest of the things. Which is badass.
If we
No,
have
that's very cool.
time still, there are a couple more things that I wanted to go over that I think are actually even crazier than some of that.
This is live to tape and it's digital. We shoot it until we mess it up. So by all means, let's make more work for Mike.
Sweet.
Thanks.
So I just wanted to show just a cool shader that I made recently for a video for one of our products, just to give you an idea of what you can do with it. So
Ooh, that looks like a mini track.
This. It is the mini track, and it's sort of materializing with this I'm not even sure, like nanotech kind of thing going on.
Yeah, I would call it that.
We'll call
the
it
blue,
digital camo for
the blue
for all,
nanotech.
Sure.
Yeah. Also, this ties in well to what I was going to move to next. If you watch as I'm playing this, it gets blurry. The reason for that is because it takes a little while to render. If you look up here, this is basically how far in it is to having a full render of this image. So every time I move it, it has to restart. It gets blurry because it's actually using a AI denoiser to sort of like make it higher resolution quicker before it actually is, so that I can keep working without it having to actually compute exactly what the render is supposed to look like. It can just like guess so that it's faster, which is really nice.
That's nice.
But the reason that ties in well to what I was going to say next is DaVinci has some really awesome AI features that I think are worth mentioning. One of the things is it has a really good built-in upscaler. So you can just I've put in like 480p footage and had it upscale all the way to 4K. And it looked a little weird, but it still didn't look that bad. As we're like, I'm sure if you went from 720 or 1080 to 4K, you wouldn't really notice much weird at all. It doesn't have a whole lot of artifacts like the denoiser in Blender has, which that's no fault to that denoiser. It's just the nature of it being in 3D instead of 2D.
Mm-hmm.
But a good example of what I was talking about with these node-based procedural editors. With Adobe, you have Premiere for cutting and editing, and then After Effects for all of your compositing, lower thirds, like whatever you want to have over top of your footage. In DaVinci, it's kind of After Effects and Premiere combined, which in my opinion is a huge advantage because needing to use the link between to sync Premiere and After Effects just again seemed like building off of old code instead of rewriting it maybe the way that they probably should have. It just makes things a lot more convoluted. But in DaVinci, we also have this node-based system for creating effects. And there's quite a few nodes in here, a lot more than you get in Blender. And you can do a lot of similar stuff, including 3D stuff. There's a 3D rendering node in here, if I'm not mistaken. And you can also use materials, and it's very similar to Blender, although not as fully featured for the 3D side of things, more so for 2D. But you can even do animations in here. And the way it works is you just drop down a node, and then I guess I probably could have picked a better one than the note node. But there we go. So you can see settings show up over on the right-hand side here. And there are also ways to make your own custom nodes as well, which is pretty cool. There's also a cutting tab that's separate from an editing tab in here, which is nice because they work differently. The cutting tab snaps everything. If you look, let me just move some of these out of the way. Oh, it's doing something weird right now that I don't fully understand because I'm still trying to learn it too. But basically, that's the advantage to the cutting view is it has like super smart snapping capabilities, which I think I may have turned off right now. And then in the editing view, I've noticed it's a lot less cluttered because it's split up between that cutting and editing view, which is nice. And another cool thing about DaVinci is you can create smart bins. So basically, there are folders in DaVinci that look at folders on your computer and update and refresh whenever you add stuff to those folders. So it can you can also use keywords to build those folders. So you can basically have it detect like, oh, this is in a file name, put that in this bin, which makes organization pretty awesome. But the last thing I wanted to show here, and this is very new for us and still experimental, and we're not really sure what's going to happen with it, but it is really cool and really promising, and pretty much anyone can try it if they want to. But you guys have probably heard of some of the AIs, specifically diffusion models, the open source ones that have been released on like GitHub, places like Hugging Face, where you can just go and download these super powerful AI models, and you can even train them to do all sorts of stuff. So the first thing we've been working on using is some of the text to image models. But we've also been doing like image to image. This will all make sense in a second. But basically, the goal is to use language models to control image generation instead of using these node networks and all this stuff that can take a really long time to learn and get used to. So what I did was I took basically the state-of-the-art text-to-image generating AI right now is Stable Diffusion. Some people might argue it's more so DALL-E 2, but it seems like the general consensus is that Stable Diffusion is, especially being like totally open to the public, the better option at the moment. And then there's Dream Booth, which is designed for training AIs on your own data sets. So you have your own Stable Diffusion model to render whatever pictures you want. So if we look at, these are some renders from Blender and Houdini that I've made. So let me just, oh, there we go, okay. Thanks, Mike. So just some examples, because now we're going to compare them to how well the AI can do this. So I trained using Dream Booth. It was 270 pictures, including CG renders like these, but also photos that Mike had taken, screenshots from videos, and trained them on 10,000 steps, which is about the recommended amount of training time for Dream Booth. It takes about 5 hours. And the results were not bad. I was kind of shocked. So if you want to see what Stable Diffusion can do sort of on its own, these environment renders can show you what models that, so to be clear, there's a model that comes from Stability AI, the people who made Stable Diffusion. It's about 4 gigabytes. And then I trained my own models, which are about 2 gigabytes. So these are not the models that I trained. This is the model that's accessible to the whole public. And if we can actually potentially, if we have time, generate a picture or two with some of these models. But I asked, basically what you do is you just type in with text what you want a picture of, and Stable Diffusion will render it in, on this machine, actually 3 seconds per picture. So it can do 9 pictures in like less than a minute, which is pretty crazy. The quality is not there yet, though, for most of them, really. But you can see they definitely resemble an auditorium. You can add more. You can see up here we have the prompt, and then the AI model, and then the seed, which is just used to get different iterations of what you're trying to make. But if we go, it did a really good job with conference rooms. These look pretty coherent. Yeah. Still not perfect. I mean, you can see the lights.
Someone
up
didn't
there.
shove in their chair, you know.
Yeah.
Messy conference room table.
It's a glitch in the matrix.
They actually might be pulling from real webcams with that kind of detail.
Yeah. So if we go, this is the model that I trained on, our own post-production images. And we have some bloopers I'll show you after the good results. But you can see these are generated in 3 seconds each by an AI that only took 5 hours. I mean, I'd say only 5 hours, but it can take a really long time to train a good AI model. It still struggles with text. And there are, there can be some concerns with memorization with AI models, where you don't really want it to recall specific things very accurately because of, copyright issue. But with when you're training on your own data, you don't really have to worry about that, because, I mean, it kind of takes one glance to recognize that, this pretty much only contains elements of things that we already do because it's trained on our data. So when you do it that way, I think you get, it seems like better results, and you don't have to worry as much about what's coming out. I will say though, there's not a whole lot of worry about that, even without training your own models, because of the way that AI works. There's a huge level of separation between what it's trained on and what it creates, even though it's able to, create relatively close. Well, maybe not that one. That's a tiny lens. I guess that could take us to the bloopers, but it even sometimes, if you add some extra stuff to your prompt, like up here, it can make some really nice compositions. And there are some solutions to the way it renders text that we're working on, because that's obviously not ideal. And the proportions aren't always right. And it clearly needs to be trained on tally lights. It wasn't, so that's why it does them like that. But yeah,
That's
definitely
awesome.
cool, especially for even artistic stuff. Yeah, the tiny lenses. I'm not sure why it does that, but it
That's kind of
definitely made
funny.
the blooper reel. Yeah.
So how long
And,
before we have an AI-driven NFT project featuring PTZOptics cameras?
well, the goal of this eventually is basically to have me in the computer for everyone to use, just free will. If you need something, you just type it in and it spits it out, and should be able to use it without worries. Just might take us, I would say, a little while before it's really usable, but it's really promising right now, especially
Nice.
considering this was just outright impossible a couple years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's kind of wild. I mean, that we start always these conversations with this intention, right? This is the topic and this is the direction we want to go with it, and then down the rabbit hole. This is probably one of the deepest rabbit holes we've gone down, for sure. But that all awesome information. One thing I did want to go back to that you did mention about DaVinci was its ability to upscale footage.
Yeah.
So a thing that we always talk about in cameras, sorry to kind of bring it back down to earth a little bit, but
no worries.
one of the things we talk about on the camera front, like the reason we don't currently have a 4K camera in production, though we do have some coming out very shortly, is because a lot of times the environments that people are operating in, or the end goal of someone's production, doesn't necessarily warrant 4K, especially if you're doing things through Zoom. Like we're pulling you in through Zoom. I think at max resolution, Zoom does 720p. It can't support 4K yet. So what you could do with something like DaVinci, if your intention was to do live to tape, pulling in people from Zoom, then doing some post editing, tossing in some graphic assets, maybe some 3D animations from Blender, then you could plug it into DaVinci and, I want to say upgrade. There's probably a more technical term there, but basically up resolution that to 1080p or even 4K. If, like you said, it might look a little weird. It gets that very like almost cartoonishly lit, kind of very bright color look to it sometimes. When you try to go from like 720 to 4K, because that's a big jump, right? You go from 700 vertical bars to 4,000 vertical bars. So yeah, it seems like in the world of post production, and this has kind of always been the case, right? The argument from going from film to digital on the cinema platform, and then the argument for going from HD to 4K on the live streaming platform. It's kind of just the natural progression of things. It's why technology is so cool, because you come out with something new every year, right? So it looks like there's some great options out there to allow you to take your existing production and add that production value, like you said, without having to add lights or go through the chroma key steps for green screens and things like that. So that was an awesome deep dive, and I definitely learned a lot right then. And then again, like if your mind wasn't just blowing a little bit, then go back and rewatch it, or you are already at Brian's caliber, or you've played with this and you kind of get that. So yeah, thanks, Brian. That's awesome. Anything
There's
else
one
really
thing
quick?
I want to mention.
Yeah, go for it. I was going to say, if you have anything else to add to wrap that kind of side of the world up, by all means.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that almost everything I just showed can be used for free in some way. And I think that's one of the best things about it is it's not a huge commitment. So Blender is just outright totally free. You can get add-ons for it that you can pay for, but everything that I showed you that I just did, I didn't use any add-ons for any of that. And DaVinci has a paid version, but the only extras you get with the paid version, as opposed to the free version, are those upscaling features. And you get some like, lower thirds, like titles, little things like that. But other than that, really, you get almost everything with the free version of DaVinci. And even Houdini, if you're not rendering in Houdini, it's free. And if you do want to render with it, as long as you're making less than $1 million a year with it, it's only $400 for 2 years. But it goes all the way to $6,000 if you're making more than $1 million a year. So it does get a little pricey, which is the reason why Blender is so nice. But yeah, all of those, you can use all of them for free. And Stable Diffusion, if you want to use that for free, I could give a couple examples, but really there are so many ways you can use it. You can use it online. You can use it locally. You don't need a 3090 to use it. You can use it on a laptop. I use an 8-core like 2-in-1 laptop to render pictures in about 20 minutes per picture with Stable Diffusion. But what I used to use Stable Diffusion and all the AI that I work with is called Visions of Chaos. That does take up a huge amount of space on your computer. It's like literally about 300 gigabytes, maybe 400. So if you want to use Stable Diffusion, I would recommend not using what I use for that, because you can just use Stable Diffusion on its own, as where Visions of Chaos has tons and tons of AIs. I mean, hundreds. But it also has upscaling, and it is totally free and open source. Just that's definitely a bit of a rabbit hole. If you want to use Stable Diffusion, I would actually recommend, I think it's called NMKD Stable Diffusion on GitHub, and it's just a little UI, and it should let you run it on pretty much whatever you want.
Wow.
And yeah, that sums it all up.
If there isn't a metal band out there named Visions of Chaos, there will be after this airs. Mike and I just both gave it the full, rock on. Anyway, yeah, I mean, Brian, that is infinitely interesting, because I think from like our perspective at PTZOptics HuddleCam, we focus so much on the production value, we focus so much on the camera, that a lot of times the backside of that gets lost. Things like we talked about audio at one point at the Tech Town Hall for this same reason. Oftentimes, people look at the camera side, they're like, oh, I want 4K. And it's like, what are you using for audio? And they're like, I'll just use the mic on my laptop. And we're like, that doesn't track, kind of thing. So like, this is a good example of like, oh, I want, all these massive cameras. It's like, cool. What are you doing for post-production? How are you sprucing and adding up your production value, either with lighting or post-production, or what are you using? And everyone's like, I don't know, but I want a 4K camera, So this is very interesting. It all comes together in the end, which is the product that everyone is watching right now on Friday here on the YouTube PTZOptics channel. That was incredibly in-depth, Brian. Thank you so much. Mike, do you have anything to add on your side? And also, anybody that uses Adobe Premiere and Adobe Rush and those things out there, these are very complex software systems, so nothing against that, obviously. I myself am an Adobe user. It sounds like Mike is as well, but making that transition. So yeah, Mike, anything else that you can add from the things that you do?
I don't have anything really. There's a ton of Adobe users out there, and people love their Adobe, people hate the Adobe. It's all about, I think there's a lot of different softwares out there that get you to where you need to go.
Yeah. And it's the same thing on the production side, right?
Yeah.
Like you have your OBS, your open broadcast software.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got your Blender, it's open broadcast, and then you can go from there, right? You can go up to vmix, and vmix has a subscription-based plan. You could start for free. and you could go all the way up to very expensive. It sounds like Houdini, you just need a really good tax accountant, and or you're actually making a lot of money before you have to like spend a lot of money to actually get a really powerful system, and it doesn't take a whole lot. So
I think a great with the streaming software like OBS, I think we we're like, start with OBS. It's free, and then eventually you're going to get good at it and want something more that has more features. And a lot of people just go to vmix, and that can also you can look at that through post-production software, which is
definitely.
DaVinci
that's a perfect example. We tell people all the time, hey, you're starting out in live streaming, start small. Get one camera, get one mic, get one light, right? Get a Studio Pro that's coming out in the next month. All-in-one little camera solution called the Studio Pro from PTZOptics. Be on the lookout for that. Coming to a reseller near you. And then go from there, right? Add a couple PTZs, get an auto-tracking camera, more lights, teleprompter, etc., and then kind of build. It's that idea of like start small and scale. As you learn, you can scale and use these things. And it's really cool that we do have a community out there of open source softwares like OBS and Blender that we can lean on. And then there obviously is a community behind that as well in terms of forums and places where you can find information just via YouTube, like you're finding this information. So yeah, if you are a live production person and you're doing some live streaming and you want to scale, maybe post-production, looking into perfecting those practices is a good direction that you can go. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up. Unless, Mike, is there anything in the chat? I actually don't have my chat open with me, but
let me take a quick look.
Like there was any questions in there last I looked. Thank you again for all of you who joined us this Friday for the premiere of the Tech Town Hall. We just went over some post-production stuff, showing you how some of our team here at PTZOptics and HuddleCam take all the production that we do in this studio, boil it down, come up with a really nice product, and then put a little bit of the magic sauce on top of it in the form of those digital assets and the stuff that Brian is making. So thank you, Brian, for joining us remotely. Thanks, Mike, as always, for being in the studio here. And actually, I don't know if I can announce this. You can cut this out if you want to, but I just had a look at the new studio that we are going to be moving into real soon, and it's awesome. So the next time that one of these comes out, it's going to be from the brand new PTZOptics studio. We might even just do a PTZOptics studio tour. I'm sure we're going to do 9 of those over the coming months, so we might do one as well. But anyway, thank you again for everyone that joined. If you have any questions or comments after the fact, always reach out to me and my team, partners at PTZOptics.com or HuddleCamHD.com. And we love to engage with you. There's a great community out there of people doing live streaming, production, and digital renderings, and apparently AIs now. And we really want to engage with you and have these kinds of discussions. So I hope that helped with anybody looking into post-production. And as always, please like and subscribe to this channel. What that does is it just makes the AI over at YouTube aware of what people are watching, and it gives them more options to learn more. So help us out with a little like and subscribe, and definitely check out all the other content that we produce here at PTZOptics. Again, my name is William Goldie. Thank you so much for joining, and we will see you next month for our 2022 wrap-up before the holidays. Thank you so much.